Thank you very much. I want to say thanks to NSI for the invitation and to Hani for the invitation in particular. I met him about a month ago in Ghana. He asked me to participate. So it's been a pleasure. It's also been a particularly great experience coming to Canada. The warmth of the people in Canada is kind of amazing. So thank you so much. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about China investment in Africa's resources from a Liberian perspective. I'm not an expert in Chinese history or in anything of that nature, but I thought the minute you hear maybe probably more knowledgeable about the Chinese issues. I think at least 2 or 3 persons working on papers for that. What I thought I would do is to give a brief historical perspective, talk about the Chinese strategy in general, and then speak about it in terms of Liberian experience. The bulk of the talk, I want to spend some time talking about the relationship, and what I think is a number of issues coming up from Chinese presence in Liberia. So basically, historically, in summary, we have basically Liberia is the same experience everybody else having. I think it's a page out of the Chinese playbook. All of the pieces are playing out in Liberia. In essence, we're talking about infrastructure for resources. We have a very dramatic experience with that. And then I'd like to conclude with 3 tensions that I think coming out of that relationship with Chinese presence in Liberia. So we began in earnest about 1977. It's basically been an on-again, off-again relationship, all tied to whether Liberia were recognizing 2 Chinas, Taiwan in particular. And then we have a history of broken relationships, then reestablishing, and then we break it again, and we reestablish. And so recently we've had a fairly stable relationship as of 2009. I think it's on fairly solid footing. China has a strong presence in Liberia. Some indications are they've had 3 very interesting ambassadors. I mean, clearly these guys have a very clear agenda and they're working very hard to consolidate that position. They've had a number of ECT agreements, and of course, people got like 130 Chinese companies in Liberia. The strategy, in my view, comes, generally speaking, from the review. Basically, the Chinese will go with heavy mega interventions, infrastructure, road bridges, power, health, education, agriculture. It seems to be similar in different countries. It certainly is true in Liberia. So what methods do they use? Well, it seems to me from the literature that you talk about state resources. Almost all of the big Chinese companies have a significant state involvement. They leverage their comparative advantage in terms of cheap, affordable capital, and of course other factors, labor, technology, and so forth. What I also found interesting was that the state engagement. Here we're talking about the ambassadors in various countries, perhaps maybe directly involved in advocating for the Chinese businesses. They tend to pursue a collective interest. And generally speaking, they do have offer some sort of aid, debt waiver, as sort of an inducement. We see limited or no involvement in governance issues, limited or no interest in CRS issues. Now that seems a little bit strong, but I think I would give it a Liberian perspective on that. So our premise basically is that we see a close correlation between Chinese investment in infrastructure in Africa, a significant increase, at the same time that we see a significant increase in her needs for resources. So I think there's a close correlation there. So our basic premise is that infrastructure in Africa is essentially an inducement or direct exchange for mineral resources. If you look here, we see in some of the main countries are heavily endowed with resources, getting some of the major investment in terms of infrastructure. So we see that close correlation. Here we see in Zambia, as an example, we see the Ghana sports, of course, a big part. The soccer stadium is a common piece. And we see that very limited or no involvement, although the literature seems to be suggesting there's an increasing interest, if you will, in CCSR issues. Basically, they tend not to take CSR initiatives, but if the government requires it, they do it. So there's an increasing, somewhat slow, but clearly, directionally, they seem to be going in that direction. So what is the Liberian experience? We see the same thing. I like the ambassador who basically said, look, we only participate in things that are concrete and pragmatic. And that's exactly what they want to do. Heavily involved in infrastructure issues, roads, bridges, power, health, education, agriculture. Here we have, in Liberia, this is the tertiary hospital. So the only one is a very, very sophisticated unit. This is the Ministry of Health, massive infrastructure. Of course, we have our share of the sports complex. Couldn't leave that out. The university, education. This is the Fendel campus. And then we have something coming up, which is on the horizon. They plan a Mecca ministerial complex. My understanding is that it's supposed to be, for the ambassador, it's going to be the second largest building in Africa under the Chinese arrangement, second only to the AU. We'll find out shortly why such an interest. It is interesting, though, before I leave there, that all of these structures are clearly visible. They have very dominant presence, if you will, and they are close on the main thoroughfare, the boulevard. So you see the Ministry of Health, we see all the Issue University, we see the major setups. So similarly, in terms of strategy, there's still resources, we see that common. So all of the companies, the main mining companies have state ownership. They all seem to be leveraging the same factors. State engagement is routine to see the ambassador meet the president with a laundry list of all the issues that the mining companies, the Chinese companies have, whether it's explosives for mines or any particular issue that has not been resolved. How do you imagine the American ambassador visiting the president with a listing of all the things that Chevron or one of the other American companies need? We also had some debt waiver, and we don't see too much in terms of involvement in governance. The other donors tend to be heavily involved. The Americans, the Europeans tend to be heavily interested in governance issues. A very limited CSR. Even where they have a clear obligation, they will make the payments, but they're not interested in how the government spends it. Unlike a BHP or one of the other companies who want to know, exactly how the money was spent and did it get to the community. So basically, we still have the same issue because ours is a question. We think that the interest there is heavily in terms of resources. Now, to understand the situation with Liberia, you need to understand the needs and the resource question very well. Liberia is in desperate need for power, infrastructure, and roads. The Chinese need resources. We have one mining concession, which is iron ore, close to operating. We have one pending application, which will be awarded. We see a very strong push for the largest and the last known deposits, the Wologisi. In many ways, the Liberian Chinese experience is a story about this mountain, the last resource. And all of them have some sort of state involvement. So in terms of infrastructure, we have serious road need, inaccessible. Many of the roads are inaccessible, just simply non-existent. If we look down these, you wouldn't know what these are, but you can see down there, we're looking at almost 2,000 kilometers of roads to just open up the country. That will cost almost $2 billion, $2.7 billion. Here, these are the roads to give you an idea of why, how critical they are for purposes of access, helping to deal with the issues of commerce, agriculture, and mining. And this is very, very serious. The second area of need is the area of power, electricity. And here you need to have an appreciation for the dire straits the country finds itself in. We are doing 57 cents, almost 60 cents per kilowatt hour, compared to Ghana, which I think is about 12. And you can begin to think about all the economic ramifications about having that high tariff. If you look at coverage, the country has barely 2% in terms of coverage, where countries like Ghana and Ivory Coast have close to 71%. There too, it has major implications, economic implications. So if you look at the power needs, and even if we talk a possibility of having a hydro, which will reduce the tariff rate to about 20 cents, we're looking at significant savings in terms of households, SMEs, okay? And of course, we will be avoiding many of the adverse effects. I mean, the loss of the economy is huge. Adverse effect on our trade balances. We're running high-speed diesel that involves importing diesels. Large number of small businesses feel they simply cannot survive at 57 cents per kilowatt hour. The high social costs. So in effect, the power situation has a strangulating effect on the economy and our social development. So what is the solution? Well, the Chinese are clearly ready to do both if we give them the resource. The approach the government has right now is to work with donors, partners, many of whom, okay, I have to go pretty quick. All right, so I'll go. And so the donors and partners, but the problem is that they are extremely, fairly slow in terms of the processes. It creates a problem. So enter these are resources. I got to go pretty fast. I will get to the last part. So we have resources on Explore. These are different mountains we have. Okay, the Wulagisi is 1,000. Okay, and the resource Wulagisi, there's a very strong interest. Now, so what we have, there are a number of different tensions I see. Infrastructure, project programs, and so forth. So in terms of intra-donor, I'm not sure the right way to put it, is that all of the construction contracts have been won by the Chinese. So the donors are paying for it, but the Chinese are doing the work. Even though the Minister of Finance knows he signed the paper, the public perception is that the Chinese are actually doing it. The other tension I see quickly is, so I don't know what the implications would be, what EU has decided they're not going to pay for any more road maintenance. The other tension is that donors, the West, the partners are involved in programs, you know, governance issues, institution building, which is great, but, and the Chinese are involved in the massive road construction, and they get a visible process. Even though the donors are paying for it, the Chinese are on the road doing the work, so the perception is that, in fact, this is Chinese work. It's Chinese getting the goodwill. What are the implications? I don't know. But I wanted to end and speak a little bit about the challenge that we have. And this is a little bit worthy, but I thought I would put it out there because it describes the situation correctly. There's a visit between the vice chairman of the National Democratic NDRC and an exchange between the president. And in here, many interesting things come out, published by the Diplo News. So we have the Chinese Communists with a full delegation, the full private jet, probably 10-man delegation, CAD Fund, CDB, all of these people, the BioSteel team. And they come and they say to the government, you know, in effect, if you look there, we're talking now about discussions about energy. And they say, look, we can build 15 kilowatts in one day. You dealing with all of these donors, and it's going to take forever. And she's responding, and you can see it down there, she's concerned about the partnership because the donors have come together to support the effort to rebuild the hydro. It becomes even more interesting. He comes back and revisits the question and says, look, the donors, this is a slow pace. You don't have to hold negotiations, which is, bid, putting up for bid and negotiating. Instead of respect our decision, but it would take too many months, we can provide the support and do it in 2 years. She has to come back, and this is very interesting. So she's steering them away from the hydro itself, which has been awarded to the traditional partners, and she's asking them to participate in the second phase, which is the Via River to build the river. And then she's talking about her important partners, the World Bank, the United States, Germany, and so forth. Okay? So in effect, the last is very interesting. She wants the Wodogisi Mountain, and he doesn't want to get involved in international competitive bidding and so forth. So, sorry. Okay. So we see that all the things play resources for infrastructure, state resources, advocating on behalf of the Chinese, leveraging speed. So we see the partners, in effect. So we have a president that's struggling to deal with the needs of her people, but also don't want to alienate her partners, her developing partners. We see governance tension, because we see that the president clearly wants to meet the need in terms of hydro, but she wants to remain committed to governance and ensure that there's a bid going on. The question in my mind is, that's sustainable in the long run? Should small countries be caught into this kind of tension going forward? Also, we see, and I want to end here, much of what we've done over the last several years, and here is to talk about governance issues, but we'll look at China with the abundant resources, her aggressive push for resources, her lack of interest in governance, the compelling and urgent infrastructure needs for most African countries, and the relative weak institutions. The question is, can we maintain the gains in terms of resource governance? Thank you.